We're going to have Dr. Richard Avramenko from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He is chair of the Integrated Liberal Studies program at Wisconsin, as well as co-director of the Center for the Study of Liberal Democracy and editor of the Political Science Reviewer. He is author of author of Courage, The Politics of Life and Limb, and he's co-edited books, 3 books, Friendship and Politics, Dostoevsky's Political Thought, and Aristocratic Souls in Democratic Times. He's currently working on a book manuscript titled The Crush of Democracy, Tocqueville and the Egalitarian Mind.
Oh, thank you very much. And thank you very much to the Freedom Project for inviting me to Wellesley. I've never been out here before. My talk today is called When Toleration Becomes a Vice, Thoughts from Aristotle. And it's based on a paper that I've co-authored with a graduate student of mine, Michael Promisel. And since I suggested this as a topic for a talk here, it's now an article in a journal called American Journal of Political Science. It's called When Toleration Becomes a Vice, or Naming Aristotle's Third Unnamed Virtue. Now, I know we probably have a mixed group here. Not everyone is a political science major, or for that matter, a political theorist. I am a political theorist, which is a subfield of political science. So I'm a political scientist, but I approach political science questions through a theoretical lens. So whereas most political scientists these days like to use data, my data consists of old texts like Aristotle or Tocqueville or Heidegger and sometimes even Adam Smith. So the genesis of this project that Michael and I were working on was the Ben Shapiro visit to the University of Wisconsin a couple years ago. If you followed that fiasco, Shapiro came and gave a talk called Dismantling Safe Spaces. Facts don't care about your feelings. And you can get all the ugly details on the internet of what happened on our campus, but let me summarize it quickly for you here. Certain activists on our campus, like many campuses, they have created in both fact and in spirit these safe spaces, and they are spaces for groups who feel threatened by what they call, and I quote the interview from that article, institutional, systemic, and personal violences. So violence, if you know your Latin, comes from the root vis, which means force, which is bound up with vir, which means something like manliness. And so violence is an injurious or a destructive force. And I've been on campus at the University of Wisconsin for 15 years, and I don't recall a single incident of physically injurious or destructive force employed against anyone, never mind who the protesters were supposedly protecting. Not a single incident of real actual violence. Madison, like the University of Wisconsin in general, it's a really tolerant place. And it's really great, I tell you, it's really great to live and work there. Yet we had a protest group of 500 students that basically attacked Shapiro and disrupted the talk, blocked the building, occupied the stage, shouted him off the stage, threatened him and the audience with actual physical violence. Well, they accused Shapiro of, I quote again, violence against their feelings of safety. And the irony is the talk was called Facts Don't Care About Your Feelings. So they said they will not tolerate his presence on campus, and they perpetrated actual violence, physical violence. There was an incident a couple years ago, you might recall, at Middlebury, where a young political scientist was hospitalized after being attacked at a talk given by Charles Murray. Well, if I recall correctly, in the name of toleration, she was thrown by her hair to the ground and had her neck injured and was sent to the emergency room. She was literally trying to escape the mob. It's not a big concern of mine, being thrown violently to the ground by my hair. So, in the name of toleration, we got violence. Toleration, it seems, is meaningless today. And this is where my co-author and I started asking questions. All political science projects, I think all good ones, start with a question like, what's your beef? What's the problem that you want to deal with? And for Mr. Promisel and I, we asked the question, how has it become so meaningless in this day and age, this idea of toleration in the hands of some 20th century progressives? Well, toleration, you may have heard some of this earlier today, if you were talking about John Stuart Mill. Toleration is a central piece of the modern Western tradition. In 1689, John Locke published a famous essay, his Letter on Toleration. This was also, incidentally, the year of the English Bill of Rights. A lot of people see this publication as the beginning of the sort of modern Western liberal order. This tradition started in Great Britain and was hauled over to America, and it was codified in 1791, I think, in the First and Eighth Amendments of the Bill of Rights here. So toleration is a virtue. And I know it might seem a little antiquated to talk about virtues in this day and age. Our tendency nowadays is to talk about things like behavior or dispositions. And I think this is a mid-20th century turn, and I think it's central to the problem that I'm addressing here today. To think of something as behavior is, I think, in essence, to kind of naturalize it. In other words, just as we can observe and measure the behavior of babies or, say, the Richardson ground squirrel, we can sort of measure and observe the behavior of citizens. Of course, we can do this. This is true. But what it does is reduce virtues to just another sort of automated motion. In other words, something like an instinct. And virtues aren't instincts. They're something that we learn through conversation and through practice. So virtues are often things that counter our instincts. Take moderation, which is a virtue. Moderation, I'll give you an example. This morning at the hotel, there is a breakfast buffet in which there's a giant tub of bacon. And my instincts told me to fill my plate with the unlimited bacon supply. But through long conversations with my wife and myself, and through many visits to buffet, I've inculcated the habit of not eating too much bacon. I put an extra 2 in there. I probably ate too much bacon, but to eat the appropriate amount of bacon. So we can ask the question, what's the appropriate amount of bacon? Well, it depends, right? And this is pure Aristotle. I'll come back to that in a second. Courage. Take courage as another example. If you're in a dark parking lot and someone pulls a knife on you, your instincts say run. And running, I think, is the appropriate response if you're alone in that parking garage or parking lot. But if you're with your 4-year-old daughter and you ditch her and run, it is not the appropriate thing to do. Your instincts are wrong, right? One needs at that point to muster a virtue called courage. So virtues, my point here, virtues aren't instinctual. They're things that we need to learn, and we need to inculcate the habits of these virtues. So like courage, like wisdom, like moderation, toleration is a virtue. So what is it? Well, here's a working definition for you. To be tolerant is to refuse to interfere with, denounce, or persecute objectionable conduct or beliefs. Let me say that again. To be tolerant is to refuse to interfere with, denounce, or persecute objectionable conduct or belief. Locke, in his Letter on Toleration, sets this down as the key liberal virtue in the wake of the English religious wars. So toleration has become something like the central virtue of the liberal tradition. I know you have been talking today about John Stuart Mill, and that the institute sponsoring this winter session is the Freedom Project, but let me just rehearse briefly a definition of liberalism. For liberals, and this is classical liberals, like John Stuart Mill and John Locke, Alexis de Tocqueville, not the 21st century liberals, which are something quite different. For liberals, individual freedom is the ne plus ultra good of political life. It's the good beyond which there is no further good. So we don't pursue liberty so that we can pursue something beyond it. For the classical liberal, the purpose of the state is to protect or to safeguard the life, liberty, and property of individuals. In other words, the state ought to be limited in its role to protecting individuals from being harmed by others. And this includes being harmed by foreign invaders. You're not free if your country is under attack, okay? So the state, for most liberals, while it's supposed to protect individuals from harm, the state itself possesses the necessary tools to infringe on your liberties. So the state protects your liberties, but it's a very dangerous thing. The state, if you think that a mugger in a dark parking lot poses a grave threat to your life, liberty, and property, think of the cruelty possible if you're armed with spy agencies, the ATF, the IRS, the power of eminent domain, rendition, Guantanamo, and so on. The state poses particularly grave threats to our liberties. So toleration is the chief virtue of liberalism. I've tried to define what I think toleration is and what liberalism is. Now, in her classic essay, is this the second time you've heard of Judith Sklar today? You talked about Judith Sklar earlier? Judith Sklar has a classic essay called Liberalism of Fear, and in it she writes this: liberalism's deepest grounding is in place from the first, a conviction of the earliest defenders of toleration, born in horror, that cruelty is an absolute evil, an offense against God or humanity. So for John Locke, author of the Letter on Toleration, this means not torturing people to death for being, say, Catholic. Any Catholics with us? No Catholics today? That would never happen in Wisconsin, because a quarter would be Catholics, quarter would be Lutheran. Virtues are good things, and this particular virtue of toleration is especially good for citizens who need to reconcile commensurate differences appropriately in pluralistic societies. This is the virtue we need when we live together with people who are different from us. So where did we start to go wrong? There are a lot of people around right now who like to suggest that it all started going wrong in 2016 with the election of the Donald. I don't think so. I think it started a lot earlier, in 1946, when Jürgen Habermas started reading books. It says right here in my notes, wait for thunderous laughter to subside. Thank you. It's like Jeb Bush. Laugh, please. No, that was clap, please. That was Jeb Bush, right? But seriously, Habermas, he's a German philosopher, mid-20th century. He's gone now. He's got to be gone now. He was kind of a latecomer to a group of social theorists who were known as the Frankfurt School. This would be Theodor Adorno and Max Horkheimer. These guys, after World War II, I would argue, and other people do argue, they kept this sort of Marxist socialist flame alive in Europe. And they simply rebranded it, this, what I think is a fundamentally illiberal ideology, as critical theory. So socialism, be it national socialism, these are the Nazis, or international socialism, which is the communists, they regard groups as the fundamental building block of society. Group rights, often couched in terms of race, class, gender, that's what we get from the Frankfurt School, take priority over individual rights, or at the very least they're at odds with. Now today, this is generally called identity politics, and for the early Marxists, the effort was to sort humanity into particular groups called classes. So race, class, gender, class, so you have the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, or the oppressed and the oppressors. So class consciousness was the clarion call of communists. This is mid-20th century stuff. So you must be made conscious, which is to say you made aware of your class. And if you don't realize what class you're in, or don't realize where you stand in this hierarchy, in the Soviet Union, for example, you'd get sent to re-education camps where you'd have your consciousness raised. And if you ever read folks like Alexander Solzhenitsyn or Arthur Koestler, these folks that experienced the horrors of the 20th century Soviet communism, efforts to raise consciousness when they failed often result in a bullet in the back of the neck. And sometimes families were sent a bill for the bullet. So, what do we have then from the critical theorists or the cultural Marxists? What have they done with this most basic liberal virtue, toleration? Well, the tolerant citizen, it's argued, should avoid causing the pain associated with uncomfortable conversations, personal criticism, or even difference of opinion. In other words, the end of toleration has changed. Whereas toleration meant not physically and cruelly harming others for their differences or for doctrinal differences, it now means not causing emotional suffering or psychological discomfort in others. Let me give you a few examples. Famous philosopher who's with us still today, Jeremy Waldron, argues that the public good, I'm quoting him here, the public good of mutual assurance is threatened by visible expressions of contempt. You may not smirk at people. His argument is that certain kinds of speech on campus should be legally prohibited to avoid making others, I quote, feel insecure, unwanted, or despised in social settings. In other words, free speech or the rights of certain individuals can be abridged if it diminishes certain groups of their, quote, sense of security or assurance, close quote. In other words, toleration is now the language that we use for good manners. Like, don't be a jerk. Now, Waldron wants to make bad manners illegal. But wait, that's not all. I'm doing my late night infomercial presentation for you now. In a 2012 book on toleration, Italian philosopher Andrea Galliotti argues that toleration should be transformed, I quote, from the negative meaning of non-interference to the positive sense of acceptance and recognition. I think the book's called Toleration as Recognition. If you don't do this, she writes, I quote, bearers of certain identities, because of their differences, will be prevented from developing self-esteem and self-respect. So toleration is about my feelings. It gets more bizarre. Another active philosopher, fairly well known, his name's David Hyde, he argues that real toleration requires us to respect and to celebrate, his words, what we believe to be evil. His example, such as female genital mutilation. We don't just tolerate it, we must celebrate it. I'm quoting right out of his book, okay? His words, we may be confident in our belief that female circumcision is morally wrong, but we can nevertheless tolerate the individuals or communities practicing it on the grounds that we can understand or even respect the way the practice evolved in their culture and the central role it plays in the overall faith and way of life. In other words, ladies, to hell with your rights as an individual to enjoy ever non-procreative sex. We should respect and celebrate a practice that has one basic purpose: to make women have no desire to have sexual intercourse out of the procreative demands of marriage. And even probably not then either. So the truly tolerant, David Hyde is saying, must celebrate actual cruelty. He didn't write that. That's my interpretation of what he's saying. You must celebrate actual cruelty to an individual. But wait, that's not all. In what can only be the coup de grace, yet another one of these cultural scholars tells us that we should reject the concept of toleration altogether. Reject the virtue of toleration because the very concept is oppressive. After all, I wish there was a Catholic in the room, because then I'd pick on you. I'm going to pretend you're Catholic, all right? It doesn't matter. I mean, I love the Catholics. If you were Catholic then, I could look you in the eye, according to this philosopher, and say, about this transubstantiation business, go ahead. I shall tolerate your foolish beliefs. Okay? If I do that, this is Locke, right? Go ahead. Transubstantiate. Consume the blood and body of Christ. This philosopher is saying, I'm actually oppressing you by saying, go ahead and do that. Why? Because to say, I tolerate your silly beliefs, see, I mean, if you were Catholic, we'd be having a nice conversation here. To say, I tolerate your silly beliefs is at the same time saying, I don't have to. I'm reminding you of the power differential that exists between us by tolerating you. It's to say, I have actual physical power to stop you from consuming the blood and body of Christ. Aren't you lucky? I let you do it. Sorry? You're welcome, yeah. So toleration then is an oppressive reminder of unequal power. Toleration, therefore, should be rejected as a virtue. There you have it, folks. So this is our thesis, my co-author and I. The fundamental virtue of classical liberalism, toleration, has become a vice. Liberalism has turned back on itself and is currently busy engaging what we call auto-cannibalism. And it's kind of the thesis of Patrick Deneen's recent book as well. So, I mean, when in our more dramatic moments we say, and so just as the Roman Empire fell when her citizens lost their virtues, so too will the great liberal peace of the Pax Britannica and her prodigal daughter, the Pax Americana. But don't get me started on her bastard child, Canada. I am from Canada. I can make these jokes about Canadians. So what do we do? Where do we turn? So the thesis here is we need to be tolerant. Okay? Tolerance is now turned into we must tolerate actual cruelty, or not even talk about toleration at all. So what do we do? Well, there are some folks kicking around who say, well, there's great resources in Scripture. I think Nietzsche sort of parked that train. That is not a possibility anymore. How about a recrudescence of classical liberal principles? Maybe. And this is the avenue that some Trumpistas are trying to take right now. A lot of classical liberals in America, perhaps even at the Freedom Project here at Wellesley, saying, well, here's a copy of the Constitution. Read the Bill of Rights. I mean, okay, we have to celebrate FGM. Here's the Constitution. Read the Bill of Rights. Where, you know, the Bill of Rights that says, you know, the Eighth Amendment, you can't do cruelty. Cruel and unusual punishment, the Eighth Amendment. I think that, frankly, I think that if you take seriously the Bill of Rights, then you're on pretty good ground to not, say, murdering people for being homosexual, which is what we ought to be aiming at, right? Like not doing cruelty and persecuting people for objectionable beliefs. You could read John Stuart Mill. You could participate in winter session of the Freedom Project and think about the principles that inform living together with people with commensurate differences. But they all have their own problems. If you read Patrick Deneen's book, you know, The Future of Liberalism or something like that, he's saying there's no going back. We can't go back and, you know, take things like the Bill of Rights, because the Bill of Rights contains within it a poison pill that's going to end up in auto-cannibalism anyways. So, is there any theoretical ground? Our proposition, and the proposition I give you here today, is yeah, Aristotle. So we'll go back even farther. We find in Aristotle a resource to save toleration from itself. Aristotle wrote a book. So Aristotle's writing like 380 BC, okay? Student of Plato's, teacher of Alexander the Great. He wrote a book called the Nicomachean Ethics, in which he defines ethics as the activity of an individual in accord with reason and in pursuit of human flourishing. And the book provides a rough outline of the human good and how it might be achieved through the practice of human virtue itself. Human virtues we're talking about right now. So virtues for Aristotle are divided into two broad categories. There are the intellectual virtues, which I have up here on the slide. Intellectual virtues, there are 5 of them, and you'll see on the slide, they pertain to one's capacity to arrive at truth. So we can arrive at truth theoretically, practically, or productively. Sometimes productively we render that as artistically. Believe it or not, poets can actually arrive at truth. For the Greeks, if they're divinely inspired, they arrive at truth. The moral virtues, next slide, the moral virtues pertain to habits or states of character that dispose us to choose good and rational actions. So the moral truths pertain to how we live and act in our daily lives. And Aristotle identifies 10 moral virtues. Courage, moderation, generosity, magnificence, magnanimity, and in the Nicomachean Ethics, there are 5 more which he calls, well, which we call the unnamed virtues. Because he says there's no word in Greek for these virtues. Here's what they look like. So translators of Aristotle will debate what they call them. But there's a rough and ready translation of these 5 unnamed moral virtues. What can we tell you about the moral virtues? Just as I said earlier, they're not instinctual. We need to learn. We need to habituate and inculcate good habits. So the moral virtues are the consequence of good habits. They're forged by consistent actions that approximate the virtue itself. For example, moderation is inculcated by abstaining from overindulgences no matter what the context, including the unlimited bacon supply at the Crowne Plaza Hotel. So moral virtues are primarily concerned with what we do rather than what and how we think. But what's most helpful, I think, in his turn to Aristotle is his most famous ethical principle, and this is called the Doctrine of the Mean. Any of you studied Aristotle? Okay, so the Doctrine of the Mean. So for Aristotle, moral virtue is best understood as the mean between, on the one hand, excess, and on the other hand, deficiency. For example, there are many examples. Courage, first virtue on this slide. Courage is the mean between rashness, that's the excess of courage, and cowardice, which is the deficiency. For Aristotle, all moral virtues admit of this mean. The courageous individual is neither ruled by fear, which would make him or her a coward, nor completely immune to fear, which would make him or her rash. So along these continua, Aristotle suggests that people are more likely to lean towards the vice associated with pleasure, or at the very least, the vice associated with avoiding pain. So for courage, if you look up at courage, people are most likely to tend towards cowardice, because to be cowardly is to run away, usually from probable or potential pain. In terms of moderation, I need to fix my slide. I will switch the licentious and insensate around on moderation. People tend towards excess in moderation because it gives you pleasure. To deny yourself bacon is to cause you a kind of pain, right? Not physical pain, but you get the idea. So cowardice, if we come back to cowardice for a second, acting cowardly is more likely to is to prevent pain. So this is what it's the one. Courage is the one that kind of dominated ancient political thought, because the citizen in the ancient world was defined by, and it's gendered by his courage. The good citizen in the ancient world was the courageous citizen. In fact, you could lose your citizenship by being a coward. There are examples. The Spartans were zealous about this. If you proved cowardly in battle, for example, you were not allowed to get married, because cowards, when they reproduce, will reproduce cowardly offspring, and that's bad for the city. And by the way, if you are of age in Sparta and not married, you get fined every year. So you're not allowed to get married and get fined for not being married every year. Sayings of Spartan women, nice collection of quips by Spartan women. There's the famous one, a mother hands her son her shield and says, either come back with it or on it. So they used shields as stretchers to carry the dead from battle. And Spartans, if you don't know, fought in a phalanx. So there would be a row of fighters in the front, and you hold your shield on your left hand and your spear in the right. Your shield covered half of you and half of the guy to your left. Okay, so if you're a coward and drop your shield, that guy there is going to get killed, and he'll fall, exposing that. It's a domino effect across the front lines. To be a coward in the Spartan context was not just turning and running away in a dark parking lot. To be a coward would cause a ripple effect of death. This is about the worst thing that you could do to the city. So the mother said, come back with it or on it. If you drop your shield and run, you're a coward. Other sayings by Spartan women on courage are quite shocking. So what you should notice on this is I've included in this catalog up here, toleration. Now, this is actually Aristotle's third unnamed virtue, book 4, chapter 6 of the Nicomachean Ethics. There's no word for it in Greek. There's no Greek word for toleration. Aristotle says it's like philia, it's like friendship, but it's not friendship because it's a social virtue that pertains to people most of the time that you don't really know. So it would be it could describe the relationship between me and you folk here. I don't know you. Right? If we were best friends, we would have a different kind of, so friendship is different because we know each other, we do things together, we have a relationship into history. So these are social virtues. Most of the 5 unnamed are social virtues. They pertain to people for whom we have no affective feelings. We're not emotionally committed to them. Some people suggest that it would be better to translate toleration here as civility. And civility is becoming a little cottage industry in my discipline right now. Teresa Bejan has a great book just come out on it's called Mere Civility. But the key is that these virtues here, and toleration as Aristotle understands it, pertains to people with whom we aren't friends. So what is it? Aristotelian toleration pertains to, I quote, speeches and actions that we encounter in our associations with others. So it could be in our political lives, could be in our commercial lives. And they're speeches and actions that pertain to our interactions with others, especially with those whom we disagree. As he says, the word here, the philia, the person who has this virtue says will approve of what he ought and in the way he ought, and similarly also disapprove. So like all virtues, toleration is a mean between two vices. And it concerns an appropriate balance of pleasure and pain. In other words, contrary to our conventional wisdom today, toleration isn't just the inverse of intolerance. It lies between two vices. I don't need to say much about deficient toleration in this day and age. We know what an intolerant person is like. Aristotle says they're surly and quarrelsome. To be surly, he says, is to be like older people who are averse to new friendships. Plato says they're grumpy and ill-humored and not at all gracious, more glum and, for the most part, more filled with complaints than a good man ought to be. This is Plato directly. Nobody wants to deal with the surly, at least not while sober. His words. The person who's deficient in toleration is probably close-minded, fierce, and possibly even violent toward those with whom he or she disagrees. In other words, the deficiently tolerant, going right here, is probably an argumentative jerk, more likely a foul-mouthed bigot with few, if any, compunctions about causing psychological, emotional, or even physical pain in others. That's a vice. We all get it. I should hope we all get it. But what's novel in this 2,500-year-old book is the idea that toleration can be taken too far. And when it does, Aristotle says it either becomes flattery or ugly obsequiousness. So the vice, he says, pertains to those, his words, it's to those who praise everyone with a view to pleasing them and oppose nothing, but rather suppose they ought not to cause discomfort, like pain, to anyone they meet. We ought not to cause discomfort in anyone we meet. The discomfort is lupeo, which is a Greek word for pain. So the distinction between a flatterer and the obsequious is this. So you flatter your boss to get a raise. So for Aristotle, it's something like the classic yes man. There's gains that you get from flattering people. I think more importantly for the point today is that the obsequious person always wants to give pleasure and avoid pain in others. And this is a problem. Aristotle says because pleasure and pain in the first place are not the standards by which we should measure our moral actions. This is key. If you've drifted off, pleasure and pain are not the standard by which to judge our moral actions. They should be secondary, if not tertiary, considerations. So if we're thinking about any pleasure or pain that we're about to put on others, we should ask, is it in the service of, as Aristotle says, in the service of human flourishing? Understood as, instead of pleasure and pain, pursuing the hedonistic, that's the Greek word, is the hedon, is it pursuing what he calls the noble, the kalon? Now, of course, you'd ask, well, what does this mean, the noble or the kalon? It's difficult to define it. Translators at various times render it as the fine, the beautiful, the fair, the good, the auspicious. These are actually, I've taken these out of different translations of Aristotle for the same word. The concept is central for Aristotle, the kalon, K-A-L. It's like, and we use calligraphy, kalon graphos, beautiful writing. Kalon, take it for what you will. Kalon calligraphy would be beautiful writing or fine writing. Greeks will use it in this sense, like, what a kalon horse, what a fine steed you have there. And so you talk about fine moral actions, or your moral action should aim at the auspicious, the beautiful, the good. It's central to Aristotle. It appears over 600 times in his collected works, more than any other meaningful word. So let me put it in a nutshell for you. Three principles. First, when we're trying to make a distinction here on our moral actions, pleasure should never be the primary motive of virtuous action. Second, causing pain in others through contestation or disagreement, for example, is sometimes necessary and moral. And finally, causing pain should never be frivolous. We can only cause pain in others if it lends itself to human flourishing. So all this means that a tolerant person sometimes steps up and responds with something other than praise. And when we do this, we will cause emotional pain. We will cause discomfort, and through this Aristotelian lens, that's okay. In other words, in the face of speech or deeds that are particularly ignoble or harmful, the tolerant person must offer resistance and contestation, even in the matter that might be embarrassing or difficult for the other. In other words, in the face of speech and deeds that are particularly ignoble or harmful, you have to step up. And I hope you're starting to see what we find in Aristotle as an alternative here. A person is intolerant if he or she refuses to do anything in the face of ignoble speech and deeds. Contesting ignoble speech and deeds will most certainly cause pain for the person so contested. It will cause pain and discomfort for you, too. What's beautiful about Aristotle is when we talk about the continuum here, right? This is context-based. So the example that I've been coming back to, let me give you an example that my co-author and I threw around. What if one of your colleagues was, in your opinion, using marijuana excessively? First thing you said is, what do you mean by excessive? Okay? I'm picking on the Catholic in the front. No, because you're on vacation in Jamaica, right? And maybe it's not excessive then at 10 in the morning, but that would be excessive if you're, say, a pilot, and you're working, right? So Aristotle, it's always context-based. Context-based. It's contextual, right? So when we say it's the mean between what would be rash and between what's rash and what's deficient in courage, so what's cowardly, it depends on who and where you are. So it's not like 1, 0, courage, no courage. Exactly in between is where you have to be to courage. It depends on who you are, where you are, who's in the room with you. It's all context-based. The same goes for toleration. So I know, Luke, here's a unsolicited advice. When we're talking about this, say you have a colleague who's excessively using marijuana. Don't call him or her out on it in a full faculty meeting when the dean and the provost is visiting. You go in her office and you close the door and you say, listen, Martha, I think you're a pothead. And I think you should maybe cut back a bit. That would be more appropriate. But Michael and I didn't use that in the final article. We ended up using alcohol because we thought, well, it's illegal. Apparently there's a sign on the highway up here that says medical marijuana legal in 60 miles. The sign says that. So it's legal someplace, illegal others, but it's illegal but not enforced in Wisconsin. We went with alcohol. It's legal, we think, and we might all have friends who are probably drinking maybe excessively. Depends on the context. Not while you're on spring break, but you could drink excessively on spring break too. So it's all context-based. So toleration. The point here is there's at some point when you have to stand up and say, no, this is not tolerable behavior. This is not a call to, a return to the ugly cruelty of the wars of religion in Great Britain. Catholics can transubstantiate all they want. That would seem fine with most reasonable people. Let me conclude with a return to my thesis of the waning of the great liberal peace. If the liberal order of the last 300 years hangs on this central virtue, if it hangs on toleration, it would behoove us to understand toleration with this Aristotelian lens. That's my thesis. So we're accustomed to standing up courageously in the face of deficient toleration. We stand up in the face of bigots all the time. But the virtue I'm suggesting has been taken too far and has become a vice. So I'm thinking that excessive toleration, especially when the guiding principle of toleration is hedonistic, when it's based on pleasure and pain, it's just as dangerous as deficient toleration. And we must not let anyone trample the actual rights of individuals because we can't bear the thought of causing emotional distress in another person. Sometimes we need to offend. Sometimes we need to embarrass. Sometimes we need to confront. And this is a pure Aristotelian principle, but we should never be frivolous and cause unnecessary pain to others. Sometimes virtue calls us to stepping up and saying that your position is caustic and your actions are egregious. your comprehensive doctrine, your ideology that demands cruelty, that demands persecution, that demands the egregious violation of any individual's life, liberty, and property will not be tolerated. And in the right circumstances, tolerating when one shouldn't tolerate is a vice. And I know it sounds oxymoronic, so let me return to the classical liberal definition of toleration with which I began, but this time with Aristotle in our pockets. To be tolerant is to refuse to interfere with, denounce, or persecute objectionable conduct and beliefs. So the key then, with this Aristotelian lens, is to have the capacity to distinguish between objectionable conduct and beliefs and intolerable conduct and beliefs. The intolerant interferes with, denounces, and or persecutes the merely objectionable. That's what it means to be intolerant. The excessively tolerant person refuses to interfere with, denounce, or persecute the intolerable, the cruel, the egregious violation of the rights and liberties of individuals. That's a vice. And the trick, I suppose, is to know the difference. Thank you, and I'll take questions. Well, thank you. I didn't even have to do the Jeb Bush. Yes?
I guess just first for context, when you were talking about like the religious wars in England, are you referring more to like the English Civil War or the...
Mm-hmm. Or the French wars of religion, any wars of religion. We're talking about doctrinal difference. Can you imagine going into pitched battle and killing people over transubstantiation? Is it real or is it symbolic? Because, the Anglicans think it's symbolic, right? We're symbolically consuming the blood and body of Christ. The Catholics, no, it's actually through the magic of the ritual, the blood. I mean, this is doctrinal. If you can imagine, it's so objectionable to you that you need to kill someone over it, right? This is not we need toleration. It's merely objectionable. That's what I'm trying to do. That's what Locke was trying to do. It's more than objectionable to kill somebody for leaving the religion. There's a...
Oh, yes. I just had a question about if you could re-explain your thesis, because I'm kind of, I guess, confused on what the thesis basically.
Can I re-explain my thesis? It took about 15 minutes longer than I thought, so it was 50 minutes. Toleration is a virtue. We're going to all agree on that, right? And it's been sort of glorified to the point when we don't interfere with people whose behaviors are objectionable. That's a good thing. Don't kill someone over transubstantiation. But it's been turned in, therefore we need to tolerate all difference. And like in the words of what I gave you from David Hyde, we must therefore celebrate differences that we would normally, and reasonable people think are egregious. So, like the mutilation of others, killing of apostates. I should have put a catalog of things that I think are worse than objectionable. So on what grounds then should we just throw toleration out because it's been morphed into something that it's not and has never been? Or can we find a theoretical, or some principles on which to keep this, what I think is the central virtue of the liberal order? We need toleration. But this happens with courage as well. I wrote a book on courage. If you take a virtue, it's a good thing. Being courageous is deeply good. So then you take that virtue and you use it to describe anything. Like, there's actually a book called The Courage to, well, just fill it in. It's anything. The courage to skydive, the courage to be divorced, the courage to to drink black ouzo, not clear ouzo. Like, it's anything. Anything you would like to celebrate, you just call it courageous. So it's sort of colonizing a virtue, applying it to something that it never applies to, and therefore you can celebrate the thing that it never applied to. So you're a tolerant person if, for example, you say, in the words that Hyde was using, you're only tolerant if you celebrate practices that we would otherwise find unacceptable, that aren't merely objectionable, like in the liberal order, the right to private property. So I mentioned, the power of eminent domain that the state has. They can take your property if they say, well, it'd be better for the community to have a big box store here. Therefore, here's just compensation for your family house, the one you've lived in for 4 generations. Here's your $180,000. Goodbye. And then you build a Costco. In the liberal, private property is sacrosanct. Now, we can talk about torture or Guantanamo. Say, you can't justify this. These behaviors are beyond the pale. Yet, if I said, well, it's all part of being courageous, I can all of a sudden whitewash it. And I think that's what's happening with the virtue of toleration as well. And to go back to the origins of toleration as part of the liberal order, which is the Lockean and John Stuart Mill era, I don't think it's sufficient. So the thesis is, if you put it on a continuum like this and say, hey, we all know what deficient toleration is, but there's also something too much toleration. You need to step up and say no to injustices. You're not a virtuous person if you turn a blind eye to cruelty. Doesn't seem like a big thesis, right? You're not a virtuous person if you turn a blind eye to cruelty. Yet here we have people getting tenure with books saying we ought to not just turn a blind eye, we ought to celebrate cruelty. Other questions? I saw more hands. Yep.
Would Socrates then rank as deficient on toleration? Because all of Plato's works that are Platonic dialogues are all about Socrates basically quarreling with people and...
Socrates, the irascible old man, is he deficiently tolerant?
And they all have to end in operaia because no one can get it.
Yeah, so I might twist that. I don't want to vilify Socrates, because Socrates then will say, since we haven't figured out what courage is, and I've just pissed you off for 4 hours, how about we meet again tomorrow and do it all over again in further friendly dialogue, right? So because it's aphoretic, I think some people might accuse Socrates of you never come to any conclusion, right? But I think properly understood, Socrates saying is because of the limitations that you have as a human being, you can't come to a actual conclusion, right? Unless you're the philosopher who's been outside the cave and you've actually seen reality for all reality. So I defended him, but I get what you're saying. So kind of like the grumpy old guy that just never gets along with anyone. Notice they're often drinking with Socrates as well, so he becomes more palatable when you're drunk. Great question. Yeah. Oh.
Did you have something? I just want to revisit something that you said at the beginning of your talk, which was that virtues are things that counter our instincts. Essentially, that something is virtuous if it goes against kind of human nature. I think the example you gave of kind of like moderation and food, that's, I think, a very clear one. But I guess I just don't fully, buy the idea that there is nothing virtuous, or there's nothing that is innate to humans that is virtuous. That humans are inherently, it's a very Hobbesian view, that humans are very kind of sinful and immoral creatures. I guess if you could just kind of defend that.
Yeah, so I added that over bacon this morning. I literally added that part to the talk over bacon. So I had thought about it, and I get what you're saying. So it's a question of ontology, like how do you think human beings are by nature? And I don't think I was actually rendering them as, nasty creatures like Hobbes does. And so as soon as you said that, I went, oh man, I might have just been thinking about moderation and courage when I added that, but I did a quick run through it. Yeah, generosity, I have young children, and they are not generous by nature, but they're also not stingy by nature. It just feels random with them, both of them, like, no, it's my chicken nugget, but you can have the other half of my cake, right? It's weird, right? But find a consistent, principled way of approach. So sometimes it might be, that might be the more Aristotelian, but I'm glad you asked the question, because you bring up the question of ontology. So what do we see, how do we see human beings as what they are? And it's on the heels of a Plato question as well. So the language that I've been using, that Aristotle's using, is the measure here for us is human flourishing. And for those of you who have studied Aristotle, you know about this thing called teleology. So telos is the end or the goal of something, and logos is the study or the science of it. So Aristotle's a teleological thinker. Let me come back to Plato for a second. Okay? Plato says the essence of a thing dwells outside the thing. It dwells in the heavens, outside the cave. If you have been educated sufficiently unto the philosophical view of the world, you will have some kind of communion with these forms or ideas outside the cave, and then you'll have a vision of reality as it is. Aristotle says hogwash, because he rejects his teacher, this is Plato, and says the essence of a thing dwells within the thing itself. And the essence of the thing is its potential. So, to live well or nobly, so the aim for which we are living our moral lives is human flourishing. And human flourishing means realizing the potential that you have. It's context-based. Every human being has different potential. So it's not quantitative. You wouldn't say this human being has more potential than that. It's a different potential. So you have potential. The example that Aristotle uses and all Aristotle scholars use is the acorn. The acorn, if nourished properly, realizes the full potential that's in the acorn and becomes a flourishing oak tree. That is the end towards which its being aims. For human beings, it's the same thing. And so a fully flourishing human being is one who's living in accordance with reason by realizing both the intellectual and the moral virtues. Some of us have different capacities, or in other words, our potential is different, but a fully realized potential is a good life. Catholics, I'm looking at the non-Catholic in the front row, Catholics tend to view the world, especially, well, certain Catholics tend to view the world through this Aristotelian lens, which is why the Catholics, more often than not, take a different view of abortion. So it's not what the thing is, it's the potential of the thing. And so your purpose is to create a field, which is for Aristotle called a city or a polis, in which human beings can most fully realize their potential. So the scientific view of a fetus is clump of cells, right? The Aristotelian view is it's a clump of potential. And you're acting virtuously if you're realizing the potential, if you're working such that the potential can unfurl. Épanouissement for the French majors, an unfurling of the potential. So, there's two ways of looking at the virtues. So we're supposed to realize the virtues, but the virtues themselves help us realize the virtues. Okay. Now I need you to restate your question, because that was actually germane. I'll come back.
My question was essentially about, you stated that virtues are things counter to our instincts, and I was just, I guess, pushing back against the idea that humans are not, in some ways, virtuous.
Yeah, so well, they're not, these are virtues, he's very clear, they need to be inculcated through habit. Practical wisdom, which is actually one of the intellectual virtues, you have to be like 35 years old before you can be actually practically wise, because it has to do with experience. But the moral virtues, I mean, one could be virtuous by nature, meaning without unfurling, without educating it, but it would just be so happen that you landed somewhere on the continuum between the excess and the deficiency. The problem with these principles is when we have to say, like, oh, okay, where are we going to be in the context? What is a magnanimous way to behave? What is a truthful way to behave? What's a tolerant way to behave? Is it requires yet another virtue. So you can't have any of these virtues on their own. Many of them depend on practical wisdom. You need to know this distinct. This is how I ended the talk too. The trick is to know the difference. So I don't think Aristotle sees people as naturally good and naturally evil, but they're naturally full of potential. So you can just sort of look at them and go like, oh, they're there, but have they arrived there through any rational principles, such as practical wisdom? Follow up, please.
Yeah, so if then humans are full of potential, is that potential finite? Is it fixed? Or does Aristotle allow for flexibility and kind of evolution in individuals?
Evolution in individuals.
In terms of like to what extent they possess these different characteristics?
It's a good question. I can speculate. I think he'd say it's given. People have different potential. That's why I said try not to quantify it. So like, a child born with Down syndrome is full of potential, right? And to fully realize that child's potential is equally good as fully realizing a child prodigy's potential. That would be an Aristotelian, I think an Aristotelian way of doing this. He's a scientific thinker. I mean, he's very systematic in his thinking. So my sense is that he would say it's given.
As in predetermined?
Right, his teleology doesn't just pertain to human beings, right? It pertains to all things, right? So take the acorn example again. Would you ask that question about an acorn? Is the potential of the acorn given? No, the full potential of the acorn realized is a fully flourishing oak tree. You can't really evolve that. Well, it's an oak tree that yields apples. Right? It is what it is, right? And if you're a bad farmer, you'd plant the acorn in a desert, right? You haven't done the right thing to fully realize the potential of that thing. No other hands, so.
Would you say in some ways that's similar to John Calvin's theory of predestination? That humans are kind of, good or bad, and that there's this sort of sorting mechanism that will determine how they are later in life?
I'd never thought about it. Any Calvin experts? Did Calvin read Aristotle? Did Calvin read St. Thomas Aquinas? Aquinas was an Aristotelian. It's possible. I think that Aristotle doesn't really put God in the picture here. It's not. It's katafusin. It's by nature. It's not like by the theos. I don't recall any language when he would say. I mean, predestination, it is what it is, but it's not some beneficent being that said, this acorn shall be an oak tree, this acorn shall be squirrel food. Right? I don't think there's an external guide on these things.
I haven't read that much Aristotle. I have read some Plato. Specifically, I think the discussions about like love and the different forms of love. And from what I remember from those, Plato kind of has this idea that a lot of things are kind of derived from the divine and this kind of idea of truth. So when Aristotle was forming these ideas, would he have had some idea of, divinity, some idea of a greater power, whatever that is?
Yeah. So like I said, he's more of a scientific thinker. And so he thinks in causal terms. So one thing moves another thing. And he does have a thing that he calls the unmoved mover. So if he gets out of the problem of infinite regress. Well, A moved B, but what moved A? I mean, you go all the way back, and he says, well, we're stuck with the unmoved mover.
So I guess building on the discussion with like comparisons to Plato,
Plato was not a huge fan of democracy, and there's like a lot of people there's a lot of philosophers who discuss, like in ancient Greece, at least from what I've read, like how democracy can very easily like decline. Like there are the forms of government, I can't remember who specifically said that, but like the forms of government are like, and they decline to alternate forms of like similar things, like aristocracy declines to oligarchy, et cetera, et cetera. So like if toleration is like underpinning democracy, then like would excessive or deficient toleration end up in like groupthink, like bad democracy? I forget what the
So a couple things. So Book 8 of Plato's Republic, well, books 1 through 7, describing aristocracy, which is your actions are informed by your love of the good, the agathon. Declines into timocracy, which is the love of honor, which declines into oligarchy, which is the love of money, which declines into democracy, the love of liberty, which declines into tyranny, which is the love of power. So yeah, in the modern world where we don't fully agree with Plato that democracy is the second worst form of government, and it's only a couple bad steps away from tyranny, although that seems to be the language that everybody's using right now. But I think Plato's right on this, and I think that we can stick with it. Excessive toleration is a threat, you said, to democracy. My argument is it's a threat to liberty. So democracy isn't necessarily going to be liberal. I can just as easily imagine the majority of people voting against liberties. And this is one of Plato's central concerns, is that people who aren't well educated unto having their soul attuned with the eternal forms outside the cave, or the eternal patterns inscribed in the heavens, that they will not be able to make good and sound, reasonable judgments. They're caught up, and this is in Book 8, they're caught up in what he calls their unnecessary appetites. They're hedonists. We are free when we're free to eat as much bacon and have as much unhindered sex as possible. Let's be Plato. I think he said something like this: to scratch every itch as it comes, without restraint. It's a common trope now to say, well, democracy is the best of the worst forms of government. Democracy, like I said, and this is the insight that we get from Alexis de Tocqueville. So democracy means equality, right? That we all one vote, one person, one vote, right? We're all equal. So when we talk about liberal democracy, I'm the director of a center called the Center for the Study of Liberal Democracy. And it seems that they might not be the same thing. You can have a illiberal equality, which was the Soviet Union. Everybody was equal, but nobody had liberty. Well, 3 people did. In the Greek world, that would have been the Persians. You have the great king, he's free, nobody else is. They're all equal, equally slaves. Tocqueville in 1835 writes, the choice before us is not whether or not we're going to have equality. The choice is whether we're going to have equality in freedom or equality in servitude. So we can have illiberal democracy. Those are ancients. I mean, that's Plato the ancient. So for us, if your concern as a classical liberal is the freedom of the individual to pursue his or her own path to happiness and flourishing insofar as it doesn't harm other people, right? That's what liberty is, and the aim is to protect liberty. The opening salvo of my talk was there are those people who are using the language of toleration to stifle other people's liberties. Whether it be what's described by David Held in FGM, we can celebrate as tolerant the celebration and acceptance of the mutilation and, I think, oppression of half the population, and just call it toleration, which is absurd to me. Or we can say, Benji Shapiro's not allowed to speak on campus because of my feelings. I mean, there's an order of magnitude here. I think one is much worse than the other. But in the liberal order, we have to live together, and we have differences of opinions and different practices, different rituals and different rites. I need to tolerate yours insofar as what? Right, that's what I end with. What the trick is here to distinguish between the intolerable and the objectionable. Any Mormons in? So my Mormon friends tell me, oh, Jesus came back to Missouri. And well, that's kind of weird. Well, it might be objectionable if I was a hardcore Catholic or something, but it's not worth a religious war. Go ahead. But I think we should also enslave people, kidnap. I'm sorry, I'm from Wisconsin right now, and we have this case on our mind, kidnapping a 13-year-old girl, and God knows what happened to her in captivity, forcing her to live bound under a bed. Well, that's not. If someone said, well, that's my religion, well, that's not just objectionable, that's intolerable. You cannot do that to another human being. Of course, we have laws against kidnapping and murder and sexual assault, right? But the gray area, some places this is legal, some countries this is legal. In this country, say it's not legal, and there's reason for it. Another case in Wisconsin. Here's a case study for you. Shall we tolerate this or not? It's called bride kidnapping. So there's a big community in Wisconsin, the Hmong community, and their cultural practice in the home country was something called bride kidnapping. I don't exactly know how it worked, but in Milwaukee, there's a case of a guy kidnapped a 13-year-old girl, raped her, and then took her back to the family and said, she's damaged goods. If you pay me money, I'll marry her. And they did, and she had 3 kids, and at somewhere around 40, got out, so to speak, and he was charged. And the defense in the case was called a cultural defense. Well, it's a different culture. It's okay in that culture to do that. So they weren't asking to acquit, they were asking for reduced sentencing. Well, this isn't just objectionable. This is intolerable. Okay, I'm giving you my opinion. Do I have any science on it? Well, I'm trying to go with combining Aristotle with liberal principles. Where is toleration? Well, it depends on the context and that, but we need to be able to come to these conclusions. Reasonable conclusions that are based on the context. And the context that we're in here is one where we say the rights of individuals to their person, to their property, are sacrosanct. I will never say it's permissible, and I will never tolerate somebody attacking your body. I'm saying this to everybody in this room. Intolerable. I will step up. Hopefully my judgment is good, and hopefully courage comes when the time comes. But don't sugarcoat it and say, oh, I'm a tolerant individual. It's culturally different. It was kidnapping and rape. Did you have a question yet? Yeah, I haven't heard from you. We'll come to you next, okay?
Mine just super quick. Why do you think that these presumably left philosophers want to celebrate things like female genital mutilation? What drives them?
I have no idea. Okay. I really don't. I'm writing a book right now called The Crush of Democracy. I'm genuinely trying to figure out how a rational person can come to these conclusions. It's a bit of a dramatic example that I use, the Soviet Union, right? 60 million, was it 40 or 60? Does it matter? 40 or 60 million people murdered by the regime for doctrinal differences? Please, just tell me the answer to that and I'll be finished with my book in about a month. I don't know. Aristotle would say poorly developed reason. Plato would say the same thing. You clearly haven't developed your rational capacity, because no reasonable person would do that. A reasonable person cannot do evil. That's Plato. Yep.
So after listening to you talk about that and the cultural differences, it kind of seems like, toleration, people try to argue toleration as a defense of cultural relativism, So I guess my question is, what if toleration is different in different cultures? Like an example I can think of is like, for example, I'm Jewish, and like obviously in Judaism, like men need to be circumcised in order to like be full Jews or whatever. But like somebody who's outside of the Jewish culture would look at that and say, well, that's barbaric, that's intolerable. But like within the Jewish culture, like it's intolerable not to do that because then you're not a Jew. And like if you believe in God, then that's obviously what you need to do. So like, where's the universal standard as what's tolerable and what isn't?
Great question. There's no universal standard. There's a reasonable standard that depends on context. So what I'm trying to do here is meld two traditions, the Aristotelian and the liberal. Right? So if you start off with the rights of individuals, right to life, liberty, for Locke it was property, for the Americans it was pursuit of happiness. So it's more broadly understood than being happy because you own stuff, right? So life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. That your person, so the liberal tradition holds that your person, your body, right, is sacrosanct. I cannot puncture it with a sword or whatever, right? It's your first piece of property. So the liberal tradition, sort of starting with that, is the one side of this tradition, right? And so if I can infuse the Aristotelian notion of context-based, right? So in the case of the male circumcision, because we've been talking about female circumcision, it's not really the same thing, right? Male circumcision, this has gone a direction I did not want it to go. I told you, okay, the purpose of circumcision in Judaism is not to hinder a particular individual's capacity for pleasurable fulfillment, sexually speaking, down the road. You have to talk, the empirical evidence, you have to talk to somebody who's had adult circumcision and ask, is it meant for that, or does it change your capacity of physical sensation? But the purpose of it is subservience to God. Okay? Doctrinal disputes, I love them.
Yes, like the purpose of it is to be worthy to God, but at the same time you're still violating someone's bodily autonomy who literally cannot give consent.
Exactly, okay.
From an outsider perspective, it shouldn't matter what the intention is, if you want to talk about like intention versus consequence.
Okay, so we live in a world of difference. Okay, so I'm going to ask you, given the principles that I've laid out here, that should we tolerate this or not?
Well, I'm Jewish. I have my views as somebody
Okay.
who's like a practicing Jew.
So within one tradition, you say, of course. So should, okay, this is great because it comes right down to the body. Okay, so should we, having the Jewish and the Muslim tradition as well, in America, tolerate that? That's the question.
Well,
right?
I don't know that. I'm asking you.
Well, I'm not going to give you, I could give you as a scholar and the Aristotelian answer to it, and I think on both my personal opinion and using this principle, yeah, I do. Otherwise, you have to, to say, no, we shall not tolerate that, you have to give good reason for it. Right, so some liberal principle, and so if you can only stick with the pure liberal principles and not find that it's context-based, right, without therefore lapsing into complete relativism, right? Is it objectionable or intolerable?
I think it depends on where you're from, which is exactly the problem.
Right, so fortunately we have, from this, I think fortunately we have two traditions. And I don't think the liberal tradition, strictly speaking, if I come out to you with the strict liberal tradition, no, you shall not do that to your baby boys. And imagine it's essential to the religion. I have therefore said that you cannot practice your religion freely. Strictly speaking, that would be the liberal answer, I think. I don't like it. Context-based. without lapsing into ugly relativism. Oh no. There was a grad student of ours presented a paper. It was a case of a Chinese immigrant in New York City who caught his wife in flagrante with another man. Now I don't remember if he killed them both or just the wife with a hammer. And the graduate student argued that it should be a reduced penalty. He shouldn't be acquitted, but it should be a reduced penalty because that was the culturally appropriate response. Okay? Chinese graduate student in the room says, yes, it might be culturally appropriate, but in China we would execute him. And she dropped the paper and never came back to it again. She's like, oh my, it was somebody who was trying to be super tolerant, right? And like, we must tolerate these guys. We still have to punish, but yeah, she dropped the paper. I never heard about it again from her. It was one of my grad students. In China, we would execute him. She went, oh, so much. So, what? Sorry?
That, I'm not sure where that tradition's from.
I don't know. I don't know either where she was getting it from, but she was trying to be super culturally sensitive and super tolerant of all cultures, and therefore I'm a virtuous person if I respect and even celebrate cultural differences or differences of principle. Yeah.
Well, what I am confused about is that when Maya asked her question, you sort of justified under Aristotle that it would be okay due to the intention of, like, they're not intending for this person to not be able to have intercourse in their future life. They're intending for this person to be one with God and such. And so, but then when you sort of give your other different examples, it seems like you're almost looking at the effect of the action rather than what the intention was. Like how extreme the effect of the action was, because what if like someone commits like female genital mutilation, not for the intention that they will not enjoy sexual intercourse, but so that they're one with God, or that they're part of a good family unit, or is like going to be a good mother, for example. And so like if you look at it under like an intentions based, I think you could justify like very, very terrible things.
Sure.
But I think that we sort of just naturally or instinctively can say that a lot of these things are bad, but we're only doing that due to their consequences. Yeah. And so I think that is where it kind of becomes confusing to me, because then it's to the point where I'm unsure how to evaluate something, whether it was like whether the intention should be good or whether or was bad, or if the action. And then another thing that I was not fully sure about was this like blurring of like morality. And this is actually like a couple of minutes ago, like blurring of like morality and the law, that you were when you were mentioning like what happened to Jamie Kloss, for example, because let's just assume that you said it was, or the bride stealing example, like let's just assume that in the monk's culture it was completely like sort of fine. But I think when you evaluate that action under like the laws of the United States, I think we can pretty much say that like it was like, I don't think anyone would say that that's toleration. Like I think that you have to be an unreasonable person to say it's toleration. And so then the argument becomes sort of unimportant, because like why are we discussing what unreasonable?
Right. So I mean on the second point, the example of bride kidnapping may not be a good one. I think the circumcision one is a better example because it's in the gray, right? We have laws against kidnapping and murder and rape, right? So it's not like they're more cut and dry for us. So I try to find these sort of in between cases. I think are more germane to this conversation. Although, I mean, I could probably give you evidence of people who are making cultural defenses of things that we all reasonable people in this country think are illegal and severely punished. The two cases that I mentioned, the argument that I heard was reduced sentencing, not acquittal. right? So, I mean, it's just, we have to understand where they came from and that kind of stuff, which it might be. But so the intentions versus outcome, well, in the liberal tradition, actually better, in the Aristotelian tradition, right, the measure of the thing is its telos, the end for which it aims. So that, I mean, I'm perfectly consistent, I think, saying that by bringing these two traditions together, it is okay to judge, to make our informed, reasonable judgments on a certain moral action on the outcome. That's, I think, perfectly consistent with Aristotle, because the outcomes, the teleological lens through which he sees the world suggests that is what we're aiming for here. So if your intention is to inhibit the potential of another human being, I think it fits okay with the basic principles of liberalism. You know, you can't torture people. It doesn't do them any good. They're not going to flourish as a human being when you've tortured people. Certainly they're not if you kill them. That's probably, you know, the least good thing for flourishing is killing. But so I don't, I mean, it may rub you the wrong way, but what I'm trying to do here is say, like, here is a tradition that we can infuse into the liberal tradition that might give us a way out of this morass that we're in with toleration becoming the great liberal virtue.
Mostly stem from, like, it seemed like for a lot of your examples, you were looking at sort of the outcome, which you just said is like kind of what Aristotle wants to look at. But then I guess the confusion was that when Maya asked her question about circumcision, it seemed like you were justifying it through the intention rather than, because if you were sort of consistent with the outcome, then it might be reasonable to say, like, oh, well, circumcision is usually done at a hospital, it's safe, the baby isn't like harmed that much, blah blah blah. Like, I think that would be sort of like comparing the outcome of the action, but you were kind of replying to Maya by justifying it through the intention rather than the action, which is what, like, confused me.
Yet I'm still comfortable with that. It may not be one or the other. It might be both. I really haven't thought about that in terms here. You know, is the intentions? Yeah, I'll think more about that one. Those are great questions. Hang on one sec. I had to look over. Yeah.
But in looking at how Aristotle considers moral virtues habits, which you do rather than think, does intention really matter? I mean, if you intend to do if you don't intend to do something good, but it happens to be good, that just means that you're fulfilling the virtue and happen to be doing the right thing.
Yeah, is unintended good a virtuous action? I don't think you'd say it is. It's a good outcome, but it's not. You haven't done anything. Like, you're not exercising virtue.
But isn't virtue about the habit and the doing good rather than just thinking about it?
So I'm trying to think of some examples that Aristotle uses in learning. So courage is the one that I'm most familiar with. There were these exercises and conversations that you'd have with young warriors on how to be courageous. So you're sort of starting with, you know, it's not, I mean, yeah, of course it's a habit, but like sports is a really good example for this. I mean, if there's any basketball players, right? You could talk rationally and reasonably and scientifically about throwing the ball through a hoop, standing on the line and doing free throws, right? But so when the game is on, and any basketball players here, what happens when you think too much during the game, right? It should be inculcated in habits that you, you could talk about the science of it when you're learning it. You can talk about the principles, the geometry. You talk about all these kinds of rational things when you're practicing the habit. When push comes to shove, you have to be ready to act. And if you're thinking, I think this is pretty good Aristotle. If you're thinking about it at the time, you might end up acting virtuous, but it should be inculcated, right? So you just do. I mean, the worst thing, if you're a golfer, I don't know if there's a golfer, the worst thing you can do is think too much standing over the ball, right? Hopefully you've inculcated certain muscle memory, Same kind of thing with toleration. It's kind of a moral memory. So it's not, I mean, these are reasonable outcomes that Aristotle's aiming at. And the reasonable outcomes you're doing, but you reason your way to them in the practice and the inculcation of the moral virtues. Yeah, I'll come back up there, it's fine.
All right, so I also have a question about, I guess, kind of what the standard is in terms of toleration. And by that, I think I'm more referring to kind of whether or not the default, in your opinion, is to be tolerant or to be quarrelsome, and where on the continuum, I guess, or if there is a point in the continuum, which is kind of our default setting.
So it's a similar question you asked, what is human nature? Is there a place that we fall? I'm going to try to do Aristotle here. Aristotle, I don't think would say. I mean, some people are born with, they're more courageous. I mean, they haven't reasoned through it and arrived at it through a sort of inculcation of moral habits. Other people are born more timid. So I don't think there's a default setting on the continuum for these. Not for Aristotle, maybe for you. I mean, I have what I call the 595 thesis, which 5% of human beings are natural born saints, 5% are natural born killers, and 90% are whatever you make them into. 5% natural born killers have to be taught not to kill. You can make 5% of saints into average folk as well. It's not really my thesis. Mike Grossman, a book called On Killing and the History of Warfare. You have to teach soldiers how to kill. It is not innate. And he gives all kinds of scientific evidence going back to Gettysburg. Gettysburg, they picked up the muskets that were loaded 13 times on top of each other without the trigger being pulled. There's a natural aversion to killing other human beings in 90% of the population. Field commanders will tell you exactly that. Yeah, you have to teach them how to kill. So as they discovered this natural aversion to killing in human beings, they went from bayoneting bales to shooting at lifelike targets to sort of numb individuals from killing other human beings. All kinds of interesting stories out of World War I, the trench warfare. Guys in the trenches, Americans and Germans on the other side, they learned how to do certain kinds of warning signals with the pattern of their small gunfire to warn the other side that there was an artillery barrage about to come in so they could all take cover. They were talking to each other because they didn't want each other to die. So if he's right, he's an army psychologist, if he's right, everyone's sort of born in the middle, like somewhere between about there and about there on these kinds of things. On Killing. Yeah, he more recently published a piece that said there's sheep, dogs, and wolves. There's 3 types. So, I kind of agree with him. Most people are somewhere in between, right? There are those who are just, naturally, I would even say rash. I have a 22-month-old son. He's going to kill himself. Like, hey, see wall, climb wall. Like, just no fear whatsoever. My daughter is 4. She's actually smart. Like, yeah, no, that looks painful. I'm not going to do that. I don't think it's a gendered thing either, though there might be some tendencies in there. I don't know. I think, did you have another question? No, we're at 20 to 3. Any breakout groups still? Or whatever. I'm happy to continue if you want.
Any more questions before we do breakout groups? All right. Thank you.
Thank you.